Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I've been doing a PhD on how to scale restoration participation through James Cook University. I'm currently working at KAUST on the Coral Restoration Initiative that they have operating there. So I have a couple of hats on, but I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea country across the Great Barrier Reef where this project has been focused on. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, as well as the native peoples on the land we're on here in New Zealand today. I think everybody's familiar with the ecological challenges facing coral reefs around the world. But there's a lot of sociological challenges associated with that. And this talk follows on really well from Ruana's talk just then, talking about policy and how we can have a more integrated approach. Because what I'm doing is looking at a way to scale restoration by simply getting more people involved. I know there's a lot of technology out there and a lot of ways to try and scale through broadcast spawning by robots of larvae and things like that, but literally just manpower and inspiring people to care about coral reefs. And reef restoration is increasingly being accepted as a more appropriate approach for management practices. And so the aim of this study was to understand what is the practice of reef restoration that most public participants are getting involved with, what are the current challenges and limitations in the context of the Great Barrier Reef, and look at recommendations with implication for policy and practice in that context, but it definitely has applications in other areas as well. And so I needed to understand what the social practice of reef restoration is, and the study was based on social practice theory. So looking at the way people do what they do and what their motivations are for actually doing those activities. And so I interviewed 33 people using semi-structured interviews across a diverse background and broad geography of the Great Barrier Reef region. The interviews were transcribed and coded, and there was a lot of reflection going back and forth through the very lengthy transcriptions to really try and understand what people were telling me, the nuances of their conversations, and the semi-structured nature of those conversations really allowed me to delve into some of the details and some of the issues that were really limiting their opportunities to be more involved. And essentially, for the people I spoke to, it was volunteers and people who undertook restoration as a recreational activity with a local community group, but it was also coordinators, people who were running restoration projects across the Great Barrier Reef, who were trying to get community members involved and engaged as part of that stakeholder engagement, which is an important component of all of these types of projects. And the people I spoke to essentially said that, in their opinion, restoration was hands-on action undertaken in situ to help the reef. And the things that they were doing was using known materials in new ways, things like scrubbing brushes to clean algae and hammers to hammer in nails, using new materials that have been developed specifically to scale up the implementation of community-based restoration, things like coral nursery trees or spiders or reef stars as they're now called, things like coral clips. And other things that became really important for these practitioners was access to reefs using collaborations with tourism operators. Funding was an important component, and having available time with the changing socio-economic characteristics of our societies is becoming a much more limited resource. Being able to implement activities is really important from a social practice perspective, like what can a person what are they actually capable of doing? And so I was curious to know what people were participating in. And they were doing simple tasks, things that they knew how to do, like I just spoke about. They were learning by doing through the project practitioners, getting in the water and learning how to clean a coral nursery or hammer in a coral clip to outplant coral propagules. And a lot of this activity was happening through workshops and educational events that the project practitioners were running themselves. But what was really important for this cohort of people that I spoke to was the meaning behind the activities that they were participating in. Now, if you speak to restoration practitioners and those involved in that field at this conference, you'll find that they are generally passionate and really dedicated, like all marine scientists are, but seems to be restoration practitioners go to sort of this next level. And there's this concept in social practice theory called elusio, and it's the emotional investment we invest into everyday activities that makes things worthwhile. And so the same reason that you're here, that's because of your elusio. And the meanings that people were getting out of participating in restoration was doing something worthwhile, making a difference, creating these social connections and building social capital to be able to get more involved in activities like these, supporting their own health and well-being, and addressing a concept called solastalgia. And this is a feeling of loss that we get when we lose things that are close to us, especially when referring to nature. And so one of the ways that they were participating in restoration, it's the combination between the linkage of the social structure that exists within the field and actor agency that enables participation. And there are power struggles on both sides of the coin. And so there's institutional power. This is regulatory bodies that control the instruments of operations such as audits and permits and compliance and these sorts of things that allow people to get involved. There's epistemic power. This is like the knowledge that we have, educational backgrounds, training. This limits and designates who can participate. And there's also individuals. And as individuals, we can choose what we do with ourselves, whether we participate or we don't. And all of these things coalesce to influence practice performance, and actors then interpret and negotiate action. And so within the structure in the field of reef restoration on the Great Barrier Reef, what a lot of people came back to me saying was that often project practitioners were engaging underqualified participants because it was easier just to sort of go outside the legislation to get more people involved, thinking that they wouldn't get caught out. There's the sale of perceived participatory opportunities. So you have these companies selling participatory experiences knowing that it's actually illegal. So they sort of use these crafty advertising approaches to say, come and plant a coral, but they're actually just asking for a donation. Or the picture at the bottom where it says, we're going to do this reef recovery day, but in the fine print, you don't actually do any reef recovery because they know that if they put that in the text, they might get audited and there might be a compliance issue. There was lots of illegal participation. A lot of people saying they were doing stuff without permits. One respondent said the permit took too long, so we just did it. And finally, a lot of people disengaging because it became too difficult to maintain their participation. And so through this study, there was a number of things that we got as recommendations, both from the people that I spoke to and also my background and life history in this field, that we think that could help increase the scale of participation across the Great Barrier Reef. And so these developing stronger local connections to restoration projects is recommended to create direct links to local communities. Crucial for increasing that place-based sense of ownership. This type of approach complements the idea of co-locating restoration projects as a way of optimising local interventions as recommended in some recent publications like this one by Pete Mumby from the University of Queensland. This is a bit of a dirty word in the Great Barrier Reef regulatory space, but commercialisation. What it would do is support initiatives that have already been supercharged through government programs such as the Tourism Reef Protection Initiative. But this source of funding may lack longevity, and so commercialisation helps to offset some of the costs of getting people involved in restoration activities and improves collaborative opportunities and strategic partnerships with tourism operators who are hosting reef restoration participants currently for free, but there would be an opportunity for them to get some funding if there was commercialisation. It's an opportunity to help develop competency, one of those key components of the social practice of reef restoration, by getting more people involved through commercially saleable aspects. Giving people embodied experiences. You can see in that previous slide with the pictures, the proponents of restoration know people want to get involved, and they're trying to sell them these opportunities, and by commercialising these activities would provide an opportunity for people to have these embodied experiences. And turning people from volunteers into customers. And the reason why that's important in the context of the Great Barrier Reef is that the related governance framework surrounding the workplace health and safety requirements for volunteers is completely different and very overregulated than it is if you were a customer. So as a volunteer, you need to have all of the workplace health and safety certifications and tickets, as opposed to a customer who can literally sign a waiver and get in the water and participate. And that would be a game changer. There was no real formal pathways for developing competencies in reef restoration on the Great Barrier Reef. So partnerships with tourism operators would be a great way to support that. There's vocational training and university courses that are available. There's organisations such as Conservation Diver that you might have heard of that has the same sort of training pathway as PADI or SSI does for scuba diving, where you do your open water course and then your advanced course and then your rescue course. Well, the same thing with restoration. You do an introduction to ecology, and then you might do coral fragmentation and coral nurseries and managing giant clams. And so there's these same pathways that people could learn and get involved with. And so by regulatory bodies supporting some of these pathways, it would complement that commercialisation aspect, which is currently not available. And then institutional actors could do it themselves if they felt like they were too risk averse to let it out to private entities, such as the same way the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority has developed the Master Reef Guides program. This could be extended to the space of reef restoration. You know, approvals always come up, and it was mentioned in the previous talk. You know, there was a request by many of the practitioners I spoke to streamline the approvals process. Developing standard permits for low-risk, non-complex activities. Things like crown of thorns starfish removal on the Great Barrier Reef now can be permitted through a standard permit that most people can apply for and get fairly simply. And there's already a document, I can't remember if it's a working paper or what you call it, that says that things like coral gardening are actually already considered a low-risk activity. And so something like that could easily be developed into a standard permit that some of these operators that are already doing work on the Great Barrier Reef would have easier access to, and those developmental costs and project implementation and setup costs would be significantly reduced. And finally, there's the health and well-being aspect, you know, a recognition by all the actors in this study that sociological degradation is an externality of ecological degradation. So by increasing opportunities to participate, countless positive flow-on effects that support the health and well-being of individuals and communities within the Great Barrier Reef region has the capability of assisting the recovery of coral reefs and building local community resilience, both natural and human. And so that's where I'd like to finish, just by saying that implementation of some of these recommendations has the capacity to increase the scale of restoration participation, not only in places like the Great Barrier Reef, but in other parts around the world. And I'd just like to finish by acknowledging my supervisors through this study over the last few years, but also a number of other people. Thanks.